Stanford University.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Michael McFaul. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute here. I'm also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and in the Department of Political Science. So our speaker today, or our honored guest, because other people are going to speak too, we have a lot in common in terms of all those overlaps. I'm going to say a little bit more about our panelists in a minute to introduce them properly. But let me first turn it over to Tom Gilligan, the director of the Hoover Institution. We're doing this together with Hoover. I want to remind you that this is a celebration. Finishing a book. How many people here have written a book? All right, not very many of you. I have. It's one of the hardest things in the world. Actually, Condi said it right. It's easy to write a book. It's hard to finish a book. Everybody's writing a book at Stanford. Not many people are finishing books at Stanford. So this is really a celebration. And in that spirit, I want to turn it over to Tom first before we get into the substance.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Hoover Institution, I want to thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate you showing up at this event. Mike, thanks for doing this with us. It's great to do joint events with FSI, and this is just another in a number of series in which we do that. I want to congratulate Condi for actually finishing a book. Right, that's the theme today. We're so happy for you, and we're so happy to hear the conversation today. The book, of course, is about liberty and democratic governance. That's a very big focus of the research we do at the Hoover Institution and the things that we're really trying to develop policy around. It's such an important value in this world to lift up the ability of self-governance. And this book, I'm sure, will show the way to do that and promote that even further in the world. So thank you, Condi. Congratulations, and thank you all for coming.
So now let me introduce our panelists. They can come up. Let me start with our, well, this is silly. You know, everybody says this person needs no introduction, right? And I was thinking about it this morning. How many people do you know that if you just reference them by their first name, everybody on the planet knows who they're talking about? Like, think about that list. That's Kobe, LeBron, Michael, Condi, maybe Barack, maybe for a while Donald. But literally, this is somebody that needs no introduction. When we were just talking about book tours, and one place you need to go, Professor Rice, is to Tulsa. I was there last week. 2,500 people came to listen about U.S.-Russian relations, by the way. And I did 3 different events, and every time I sat down to the meal, if not the first question, it was always the second or third question was, do you know Dr. Rice? That's all they wanted to know about me as a Stanford person. Do I know Condoleezza Rice? Well, I do know Condoleezza Rice. I'm honored to know Condi, as we call her. She is currently, just so you know, the Denning Professor of Global Business and Economy over at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Steve and Roberta are here today. Great to see you here. She is also the Thomas and Barbara Stevenson Senior Fellow of Public Policy at the Hoover Institution. Is Ambassador Stevenson here? There is Ambassador Stevenson. Good to see you here too, Tom. And a professor of political science at Stanford and a courtesy appointment here at FSI. She's also a founding partner of Rice Hadley Gates. And the rest you all know. From 2005 to 2009, she was our Secretary of State. Before that, served as the National Security Advisor for President Bush for 4 years. She joined the faculty in 1981, maybe that's something people don't know, and served here as provost from 93 to 96. And 99, excuse me, sorry, 99. And really, you know, in my opinion, is a mentor to me and is a model to me of what one can do, having a foot in academia, but also having a foot in the policy world. So as I mentioned before, there is nothing harder, I believe, than I've served in government too, nothing harder than finishing a book, so I'm glad we get to celebrate it. But we're going to celebrate it in a very academic way. I don't see any champagne up here or vodka. That's how we would do it if we were in Moscow. We're going to celebrate it by having Condi interact in conversation with me from time to time. I'm going to be the color commentator here and mediator. But we have 2 fantastic commentators and questioners to join us today. One is Frank Fukuyama. who is a senior fellow here at FSI and currently runs the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. There are very few people in the planet, I'm trying to think of this, and most certainly none as cited as frequently as Professor Fukuyama is when it comes to issues of democracy and governance. He is truly prolific on this issue and writes about it over the course of hundreds of years and thousands of years, just not snapshots. His last book was called Political Order and Political Decay. I think we launched it here when that came out. And joining Frank will be Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Senior Fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, a longtime neighbor of mine. He's known my kids since they were little. When one of them couldn't quite remember your name, Larry, when he was a little guy, he just called him Mr. Democracy. Because we have so many books of, with the word democracy in them around our house.
Nice.
Larry just completed another book, In Search of Democracy, that just came out last year. And so we couldn't imagine a better combo to be in discussion with Condi about this book. So without further ado, let's come up to the panel, and I get to ask the first question. So, Secretary Rice. I'm going to jump back and forth between secretary and professor from time to time. I was digging around a little bit this morning, and it turns out that not many secretaries of state write books at all. Most that do write about their time in government, as you've already done. That book was published in 2010?
10.
And then some write
2011.
2011, and then
1 in 10, 1 in 11.
I was just going to get right. So I just want to underscore how prolific Secretary Rice is. She's already written 2 books after leaving the government. The second one, of course, was about your life. Usually one book is enough. You did 2 after that. But I think there's only one Secretary of State, and that's Henry Kissinger, that has continued to write analytic books after they were Secretary of State. I thought of it, there may be some.
You're missing another sitting in the front row.
Well, actually, I didn't see George here.
Well,
I didn't. So there's one.
Mike, let me bail you out. He's an economist. They write different kinds of books, okay? Yeah.
Well, so it's great to see George here. I did not see him. I actually carried his memoirs on my desk literally for every 5 years that I was in the U.S. government. And a little magnifying glass that you gave me, George, with the inscription "Trust but Verify," has been sitting on my desk for the last 15 years. And people would come into my office, especially in Moscow, and they would look at your memoirs and say, why are we looking at that book? Why is that sitting on your desk? And there's a reason for it. And I don't want to get into a contest of who wrote the best book about their time in government, but both of those are really important books. But this is a big analytic book. And I'm curious to start off, why? I mean, you do a lot of things in the world right now. You're very busy. You run a company, you're here, you have all these different jobs, you're engaged in many things around the world. It takes time, a lot of time, to write a big analytic book like this. Why did you decide to do it?
Well, first of all, thanks, Mike, and thanks to my fellow panelists, and thanks to Tom Gilligan. And Stanford is just a great place to be because you have wonderful students, you have wonderful colleagues, and you get a chance to step back from experiences that you've had and try to put them in context. And to a certain extent, I have wanted to write this book almost all my life because I think this thing that we call democracy is actually a bit mysterious. How is it that people come to trust these abstractions, constitutions, rule of law, courts, to both promote their interest, to settle their differences, to find ways for change in an orderly fashion? How is it they come to do that when it would be just easier to trust clan and tribe and family, religious group? And so democracy is a little bit mysterious. And yet, I associate myself with those who say that it is the only form of government in which human beings actually reach their full potential and reach their full dignity. And so I've always wanted to understand better what we call democracy, how people get there, how they fail and trip sometimes when they're trying to get there, how they succeed. And one reason that I say is, maybe it's been there all my life, is that I believe I personally have been fortunate enough to be the Soviet specialist at the end of the Cold War. I was fortunate or challenged to be the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State after 9/11. But I also experienced one other great democratic transition. I was a child in Birmingham, Alabama. And I watched as America finally, in a second founding, included people like me in We the People. And I relate one episode in the book. I'm with my uncle, and he's picked me up from school, and I'm 6 years old or so, and there's an election in Alabama. And George Wallace was running for governor. And there are long, long lines of black people, because of course the South is segregated at this point. And I say to my uncle, I've heard of this man, George Wallace, and I've heard he's not good for Negroes, as we were called in the day. So I say to him, so Alto, if all those people are voting, then clearly George Wallace can't win. And my uncle said, no. He said, Negroes are a large minority, but we're still a minority, so he's going to win. And I looked at him and I said, then why do they bother? And my uncle said, because they know one day that vote will matter. And as I've watched long lines of people on every continent on the earth stand in line believing that one day that vote will matter, I have come to believe that one of the most important moral obligations that we have as people who are fortunate enough to be among those whose votes matter, that we have to advocate and speak for them. And so I wanted to write a book that could speak to my colleagues who study democracy. That's Professor Rice, and to my students, some of whom are here, that's Professor Rice. But also, as Secretary Rice, I've watched those struggles, and I wanted the book to be by both of them.
Great answer. Larry, you get the first question, soliloquy, comments.
Well, let me say, as a democracy scholar, I think it is a very important book about democracy and a highly original book about democracy because of the way, and we've already heard the first of the many ways, the book weaves back and forth through, in between an analysis of the state of democracy in the world and your personal experience. This is an incredibly moving book. It's an eloquent tribute to the American experience, to America's role in the world. I want to ask you about that later. And to the moral and practical value of democracy, and having your personal experience as Secretary of State and your encounters after you've left government, traveling around the world, woven into your analysis, I think makes this a totally unique book. I thought I would just recount the 5 lessons that Condi conveys in this book, give a moment of comment about each one, really a moment, and then ask you the question that I wanted to start with. So let me combine first lessons number 1 and number 5, which are first that work with what is there. We've got to be realistic. No place is a tabula rasa. And number 5, it takes books. So it takes time. It takes a book to understand that it takes time. So one of the many things I like about this book is the remarkable balance between realism. A lot of people have thought of you in your scholarship as a kind of realist, and so they might be surprised to find how much there is a moral core to this book and a moral vision, I think, for the United States that would be good for us to recall now. But we've also got to be realistic about our own experience, which you talk about, and the fact that any kind of democratic progress is an incremental progress. You emphasize it's a linear process. Unless you're kind of, maybe lucky enough to get the invoking of some prior experience in a few Central European countries where communism was artificially imposed, you're not going to get to democratic consolidation and liberal democracy quickly. I have really no further comments about those 2 lessons except to convey them to the audience and embrace them. Then you talk about first presidents mattering and have some very eloquent words about Nelson Mandela and the example he set. I would only note here, I don't disagree with this, that second and third and subsequent presidents matter a lot too. And of course, this now shades into the end of the book and the moment we're at now. But we were talking about this before. Maybe you could reply to this at some point. With the rise of Erdogan, the rise of Duterte, Viktor Orban, of course, in prime ministerial system, prime ministers matter. We're seeing how much damage leaders can do that might be second or third or fifth or sixth when democracy is really not firmly consolidated. Or frankly, even as in the case of Hungary, when we thought it was and we're finding out that it wasn't. You talk about crisis presenting danger and opportunity, and there's some very interesting discussion, which again might surprise people, since last time people checked, they didn't see Latin Americanist in your profile, about Colombia, which is a country you care about and where I think you convey the Bush administration made a difference in at a critical juncture. And then you talk, and I really want to underscore this, politics must connect to the people. And I want to speculate that this bulk of the book and that section of the book, which also talks about the Liberal Party platforms in Ukraine and Russia not speaking to, quote, the widows in the Rust Belt cities, and the kind of arrogance and detachment of liberal parties, I want to speculate that that was written before Donald Trump, before Brexit, before any of that. And I think it is remarkably prescient in terms of the broader canvas of democratic politics. So those are the 5 lessons. Now I want to add a 6th one and ask you to react to that. I think that you repeatedly talk about how damaging and corrosive corruption is. And I want to suggest that, you know, there are many other lessons one could draw from the book, but a recurrent one is that governance really matters. And if you've got feckless and corrupt governance with a weak rule of law, that is really corrosive to the prospects for democracy. So I wonder if you could expand on that and then talk about, because I'm not going to say any more to distill, some of the ways that the Bush administration responded to that with really significant innovations like the Millennium Challenge account.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Larry. And let me just say, absolutely, subsequent presidents matter. I just want to say why I focused on first presidents. They sort of set the tone. The story that Larry's telling about Nelson Mandela was that President Bush was meeting Nelson Mandela for the first time, and I said to him, you know, you've been at odds about Iraq, so why don't you start with AIDS, and you can talk about that. And much to my surprise, he sat down, and the first question he asked Nelson Mandela is, why didn't you run for another term? And Mandela said, well, because I wanted my African brethren to know it's all right to step down. And I was struck. George Washington, who Alexander Hamilton would have probably made king, would hear nothing of it. And that's why. And Yeltsin, on the other hand, as the first president, really ruled by decree, went around the parliament, weakening the parliament. And now, when it's Yeltsin in the presidency, that's one thing. But now Vladimir Putin with that presidency is quite another. So just to explicate on that for just a moment. As to corruption, you're absolutely right. There's nothing more corrosive. And we did try some innovations, including in the Millennium Challenge, which was a very big aid program, but it was premised not on, yes, you need aid, but if you are a country, a leadership that's trying to govern wisely, you're investing in your people, you are keeping laws from disempowering women, you are governing democratically, you're opening up your economy, and the first one, you're fighting corruption, then you are eligible for this aid. So there are actually indicators as to whether you were fighting corruption, and if you weren't, we're not going to even have a conversation with you about aid. And that was the difference in the Millennium Challenge. There are some other efforts out there. We have former President Ilves here, and in the Baltic states, E-governance is increasingly a way to be transparent about governance. I remember even Salam Fayyad in the Palestinian Authority saying, I'm going to publish the budget for the first time. So that's a way. The Indians are experimenting with biometric data. Now, why is that important? It's important because if you live out in a remote village, you've always had to get your benefits through the middleman. The middleman gets a cut. Now, without the middleman, you start to cut out some of the corruption. So there are some ways to approach this, but I just want to relate something that I've read through Frank's writings. It took the United States 100 years to actually end patronage in a significant way, to build a civil service that was not a patronage civil service. So even this takes time, but it is obviously one of those elements that you want to pay a lot of attention to.
Frank.
So
Come back to you, Larry.
Yeah, I completely agree with Larry. That's a really fascinating book, and I do think that that mixture of the personal and the historic was really great. It was a nostalgia trip for me. I particularly like the chapters, the opening chapters on Russia and the collapse of communism in Ukraine and other countries. I think that it's really good for students that didn't live through that period to read that, because it was such a miracle. It was so unexpected. And, for me, actually, it was quite nostalgic, because I was actually on a couple of those trips you described. I was at that Big Sky Summit with Shevardnadze, and then the big trip that Bush took to Gdansk in the summer of '89. And I think you do a very good job of conveying what a political earthquake this was. You referred to Ross Johnson, and I remember him coming into my office and saying, you have no idea how fast things are progressing. And I remember dealing with the State Department bureaucracy at that time, even after the Polish Roundtable and the announcement that the wall was coming down. They kept saying, well, but we still have to deal with the Warsaw Pact. And I said, what?
Exactly.
I mean, so anyhow, that's a really terrific, personal account of that history. I guess what I wanted to ask you in retrospect, and since you are a Soviet specialist, what American foreign policy, what mistakes we made. Now, I do not want to rehearse that whole argument about NATO expansion.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the main thrust of the critique, that if we hadn't gone to, Thomas's country, that Putin would love us. I mean, there's no way of answering that counterfactual. But it does seem to me that, there are some other big mistakes that we made in the early, especially in the early years, in the early 1990s, in terms of economic policy and the kind of advice that we were giving Russia, and whether that bore lessons for how we ought to approach, similar kinds of developments in the future.
Well, Frank, you and I very well remember that period, and governments are actually sometimes slow to respond. My State Department story is that you'll remember that amazing May Day march in 1990, and it was usually, the communist leadership stood on top of the Lenin mausoleum, and they would review people coming by. And this time, because it was Gorbachev, it was, glory to Perestroika and glory to Gorbachev, basically. And then at the last minute, there were about 70 people carrying signs that said, communism is 70 years on the road to nowhere. Right? Now, this had not been Gorbachev's idea to have these people. And I remember that the embassy report was about who was standing next to whom on the Lenin mausoleum. So no sense that things had changed dramatically. And I want to use that to say one word about something I hope we'll get to, which is the press. I used to go to the Soviet Union a lot as a young Soviet specialist. And especially as the Gorbachev era was unfolding, I would first go to see the journalist. People like Phil Taubman, who is here at Stanford, or Felicity Beringer, or Bill Keller, because they knew the place and could get out to places where American diplomats couldn't. And just a little bit of an advertisement. I hope that when those decisions are being made in newsrooms these days, that they're actually investing in people who can be out in these countries and know them. So that's just something that I want to emphasize. Now, the interesting thing about what we tried to do, I think everybody was very excited after the wall fell, after the Soviet Union collapsed. It looked like Russia was ready to take off. If you look at a lot of the indicators or a lot of the variables that political scientists would say can give you a successful transition, a democratic transition, Russia had a lot of them. Population that was probably 99% literate. At least in economic terms that we could see, pretty good GDP, industrialized, lots of resources. And so the idea was all you really have to do is take off this communist cap and then you'll free all of that. And so it's not surprising then that the policy decisions were, let's privatize all of those companies and they'll be ready to take off. I went once, and it's relayed in the book, I went once to the defense conversion had become a big deal because some of the best people, the best assets were all in the defense industries in the Soviet Union. So Bill Perry and David Holloway and I go, and we are seeing the defense conversion effort. And the first thing they roll out, first of all, every plant manager has crossed out plant manager, it says CEO. And then they started rolling out their new products. Baby carriages made of titanium. A food processor that's about this big, made of some unknown military material that they no longer had use for. My point is, it looked pretty easy, actually. You were just going to kind of unleash all of these forces. What the book tries to say is, we forgot that institutions matter. And what institutions hold is both a memory of what you've been through and a kind of anchoring of how you get to the future. My view now, and I really hadn't held this view until I wrote the book, it's really kind of presaged in Mike's excellent book about the Russian post the Yeltsin period. We undervalued what Gorbachev had done. We undervalued the degree to which the freeing of the political system, the freeing of the press, the beginnings of the emergence of civil society, even under the Soviet Union, might have left Russia with a better institutional infrastructure. And we kind of blew past all of that. We started privatizing, we started talking about democracy. It had to look like our parliament. And I think had we nurtured this as more of a transition. We tend to think of the transition as the Soviet Union collapses on December 25th, 1991, and then the transition begins. I think I could argue that the transition actually began in 1987, 1988, and we undervalued those institutions. Gorbachev once told me, I want the Soviet Union to be a normal country, he said. And what he meant by that was that he wanted it to be, he believed that Stalin and force and the lies had all made it an abnormal place. And if you could free it from that, maybe it would find its way in European democracy. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should try to hold on to the Soviet Union. Thank goodness it collapsed. But some of the things that he did in that 3-4 year period might have been building blocks. And it goes, Larry, to the point that you raised when I say work with what you've got. Sometimes we undervalue institutions that are already there.
Another question, Frank, or Larry, or me?
Well, if we move on past the, that early phase of dizzy with success, it seems to me that there were, in your second tour with the younger Bush, there were some lessons that I would like you to reflect on, which really have to do with the limits of American power, and particularly the type of power that we deploy the most readily and have the most of, which is hard, military power. It struck me that the problem in a lot of parts of the world is actually not with democracy. We can actually sponsor elections, and both Afghanistan and Iraq have had election-like events, if not real elections, but things that produce, reasonably democratic leaderships. The real thing we have problems with is state building. And that gets to part of what Larry was saying, that modern state is one that is not horribly corrupt, in which the elites are simply sharing rents. They can defend their own territory. They can actually use power effectively to enforce laws and so forth. And it seems to me that the experience, the lesson I draw from both Iraq and Afghanistan is that for all of the money and, brain power, resources, and people that were invested, we still don't have slightest idea how to do this. That then is an important lesson for American foreign policy, and that's affected my view towards Syria, because given that we have really very limited tools with which to build an effective, legitimate state in situations where a dictator has been removed, it does seem to me that you maybe should be a little bit more cautious about taking that step. But I wonder if you draw similar kinds of conclusions. And
before you answer, can I pile on this
Yeah.
a little bit? Because I snuck in a few of my students are in the class, in the back benches today. I'm teaching a course on American foreign policy right now, and we just did Afghanistan and Iraq yesterday. I think this sentence will jump out at some of my students, so I just want to read it for you. And this may not be in the final version, this is in the penultimate version. We overthrow vicious and dangerous dictators who threatened our security, not to bring democracy. And then further down, Professor Rice writes, military power is not a good way to create a democratic opening. I've never believed that and never will.
Yeah.
I think those are going to jump out at people when
Yeah.
they read that. So reflect on the moment right then. And in particular, I've wondered as I've written about this, because analytically, I've also read Frank's book on Afghanistan and state building. Is there a choice if you go into a country and not try to build democracy? Thinking about our own institutions, and just tell us a little bit about how it felt in real time as you thought about, one, the threat, and then two, what comes afterwards.
If there's one thing that I hope this book does, is to allow people to separate democracy promotion from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, maybe Syria. And here's what I mean by that. I would never have said to President Bush, we ought to overthrow Saddam Hussein so that Iraq can be democratic. I would never have said to him, we ought to overthrow the Taliban so that Afghanistan can be democratic. We knew we had a security problem in Afghanistan. They had a safe haven for al-Qaeda. We overthrew the Taliban to prevent the next 9/11. We believed we had an imminent security threat in Iraq. It turns out the intelligence was not accurate, and it was not the imminent threat that we did, but that was the reason for Iraq. I'm going to leave aside Libya, which looks to me to have been more of a humanitarian intervention. Now, if you decide you want to do something in Syria, it's because of a security threat. But let me just speak to the two that I was involved in, Iraq and Afghanistan. So the purpose here was to deal with a security threat, and you deal with a security threat through military force. We didn't go and defeat Hitler to bring democracy to Germany. We defeated Hitler with our military power. We didn't go to defeat Imperial Japan so that we could bring democracy to Japan. We defeated them because of the security threat. So security threat's now defeated. And I don't think anybody had much doubt that we would be able to defeat Saddam Hussein, right? Or the Taliban for that matter. But now your question, now what do you do? Because you now are responsible for the future of this country. And we actually had a debate in the Bush administration as to whether or not it should be our goal to try and leave a democratic Iraq, or an Iraq that was on the pathway to democracy, or whether we should just find some general who was not accused of war crimes and let him run the country. And in a very long series of discussions, and some people saw this differently, Don Rumsfeld saw it differently, we decided that we believed that we'd done enough of the find a dictator and put him in power in the Middle East, and that was a lot of the reason the Middle East was the way that it was. And so helping the Iraqis to find a decent democratic pathway made sense. And by the way, if Shia and Sunni and Kurds were ever going to live in one body, it couldn't be because somebody oppressed somebody else. It had to be because they all bought into some institutional structure. That's how the decision to try to bring democracy came about. Now, Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Kim Jong-un in North Korea are the most stressing cases because totalitarian systems, and I talk about different systems, Totalitarian systems don't have essentially any institutions underneath. They've got a cult of personality at the head. Every institution is in the service of the state. That's where totalitarian comes from, which was Mussolini's phrase. So for instance, in Stalin's Russia, Stalin's Soviet Union, Prokofiev and Shostakovich are persecuted for not writing music that's socialist enough, right? That's how can you tell if music's socialist, right? That's how much in totalitarian societies.
It sounds bad.
It's yeah. Well, in this case, it didn't sound like the good folk people of Russia. All right. So a totalitarian case is the most stressing, and it's sad that usually a totalitarian case also it presents itself when the totalitarian's been overthrown by some external power. Most cases of democracy promotion don't look like that. They look more like Colombia, a country that has some democratic institutions, has had elections that turn over government, but can't control now 30% of its territory because of the insurgency. The courts have lost all credibility because they've been turned over. Basically, people believe the AUC gets off and the FARC is fighting. And so that's democracy promotion. Liberia, a crazy Charles Taylor, warlord, who has child soldiers, including a little boy who shows up on the front pages of the New York Times with a teddy bear backpack and an AK-47 in his hand. Democracy promotion's going in and helping Liberia solve that problem. Democracy promotion is when the Soviet Union collapses and you're left with a Poland or an Estonia that have actually pretty sound senses of identity, but they need help in taking the next station. So I understand why when I say, particularly me, when I say democracy promotion, people say, how can you say that given the way Iraq has turned out? Now, by the way, I'm going to say, I don't think Iraq has yet turned out. This takes a long time, and at least when you need to get rid of a strong man like Maliki, he steps down. Arab strong men don't step down. But democracy promotion really usually doesn't and shouldn't start with military action.
Larry.
Well, this is probably going to be the last question I'll ask because we need to get to the audience soon. So I do want to preface it by 2 words of gratitude. First of all, thank you for launching this book here at Stanford and at Hoover and FSI jointly in this room. And second of all, to return to my earlier point, I do want to acknowledge what a remarkable thing it has been for the last 8 years to have 2 former secretaries of state, widely internationally admired, sitting in that building over there. And I think sometimes we lose sight of what an extraordinary thing that has been for Stanford University and for Hoover. So,
and I might add Secretary of Defense.
And Bill Perry right upstairs.
And our friend Steve Chu. So we've got a lot of cabinet officers should they be needed again. Just kidding.
Past, present, and future, who knows? But to come back to the Middle East, there's a very long, deep, and at times personal chapter on the Middle East in this book. And I think there are many other observations that might strike people from that chapter. And one of them, which I strongly agree with, is the Arab Spring is not over, friends. And we've got Abbas Milani in the room here, so I'll highlight this point too. Don't write off Iran. So I agree with you. I just was talking with Barham Saleh yesterday, who you know well, and he was making the very point you're making. Iraq is a story that is unfolding and will be unfolding for many years and possibly decades. And oh, by the way, if you're looking at the Middle East, well, as you know, we do have one democracy there now, Tunisia, and at least political pluralism of sorts in Iraq and in Lebanon in different ways. Huh?
Israel. You meant
Well,
the Arab
yes,
Middle East,
of
right?
course.
Yeah.
In the Muslim Middle East. No, of course there is the extraordinary exception that Israel has been. But so can you elaborate on those parts of the Middle East, on the Arab world and Iran and Turkey if you wish, and why you say that we shouldn't write off the democratic prospects in parts of the world where I think many Americans are now prepared to just wash their hands of democratic prospects?
Well, I'll make 3 points quickly. The first is that we tend to talk about the Middle East, but in fact, there's great variability across the Middle East in the raw material that you can work with. And one of the things that I try to emphasize in the book is when you go in, see what the raw material looks like. And by the way, one of the purposes of democracy promotion ought to try to be to improve the raw material so that at some point, and by that I mean institutions, civil society, the press, independent courts, etc. Now, in the Middle East, it ranges from the totalitarians that we've recently seen overthrown, all the way out to a young democracy like Tunisia, a pluralistic society like Iraq. There's a lot in between. There's Egypt, which has gone backwards, but which of course still has an active civil society, underground these days, which has a business community, keeping its head low these days, but still there. You have in the monarchies a lot of variation, where they seem to be believing that you might be able to even substitute economic rights and women's empowerment through education for political rights. We'll see. That's an interesting attempt. So the Middle East is much more variable than the disaster in Syria, and that's the first point. The second point is, yes, we could wash our hands of it. We could say we are no longer dependent for oil because we're going to develop the North American platform, and we can just, it will come home to us. It did on 9/11. It will continue to in the form of the ISISes that come up and then bring us the San Bernardinos or the Orlandos, and so we ignore it at our own peril. Then the third and most important point. We might wish for the old days of stability, but meaning, you know, autocrats and totalitarian leaders who suppress their people and kind of keep a lid on it. But there's a reason that lid blew off. You can only do that so long before people won't tolerate it any longer. Today, when what happens in the village doesn't stay in the village, so somebody self-immolates in Tunisia and it sets off a revolution in Egypt. If you think for 1 minute that these people who are living with corrupt, dynastic, authoritarian governments that don't deliver aren't going to eventually find a way, the Iranian population, and I'm glad Abbas is here because he's done some of the best work on this. The Iranian population, 70% of them under the age of 30, outward looking. One of these days, that regime is going to find that they aren't able to keep a lid on this. And so when we say one of two things, we'll ignore them and let them keep a lid on it. It's the most short-sighted policy that you can have. So in the short term and in the medium term, I would hope we take an attitude, no, we aren't going to be able to do it for them. But we are going to support voices who want to see a different Middle East. We are going to engage them. We are going to have students in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford who come from those places. We are going to support civil society because ultimately these are not stable regimes. Authoritarianism is not stable for one reason. Authoritarians know that their people have no peaceful way to change government. And therefore, they're fearful of their own people. And so they oppress, and it's a cycle of oppression and revolt, repression and revolt. We should be hoping for reform in the Middle East, particularly among our allies. One could say that the problem with Egypt and what we faced when people were in the square against Mubarak is that Mubarak, had he reformed, and he started to do so in 2005, we might not have faced that dilemma. But I've heard people say, particularly some of my friends in the Middle East, why did America pull its support from Mubarak? His people are in the streets saying, you have to go, and President Obama's supposed to say, oh, no, actually, you stay. No, the work to be done was to be done before they got to that moment, and that's how I think of democracy promotion.
That's why the book is so good.
And if I could just add, Frank, you're going to get the last question. First of all, remember the 80s, there were some great cases of that. Yeah. The Philippines, South Korea, and Chile, and you can read about them in Triumph and Turmoil in George Shultz's memoirs, as I did, as we talked about how to deal with the Middle East in real time in 2011. There are lessons learned that can help policymakers. But I want to ask one last big question, then Frank gets the last question, and then we're going to turn to everybody here. And again, I just want to quote this great phrase. You're in, it looks like you're in Germany, you're in Berlin, 2004, National Security Advisor, meeting with your counterparts, talking about tradition of democracy in either Iraq and Afghanistan. And you ask, this sounds like you, what precisely was the German democratic tradition before 1945? And that, in some ways, that question, you've been talking about institutions and that part of it, but before institutions or to the side or however you want to conceptualize it is culture. And most certainly in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East, in Russia, Ukraine, lots of places, this cultural variable comes up as an impediment to democracy. Tell us about, since then, how you think about culture, either as facilitating or impeding democratic change.
Well, first of all, I believe that when political scientists have no explanation, their residual explanation is culture. So if you can't explain it, it must be culture. And how do I think about culture? So culture is not something that you just kind of covered in. It's a sum total of experiences, shared experiences from the past. It might be experiences that were difficult. It might be experiences that were triumphant. It might be a particular way of looking at the world because of those experiences. But I think it's less mysterious than this thing that just kind of covers people. I also fundamentally believe that culture is not, therefore, an explanation for why some people can be democratic and why some can't. We have been through more cultural explanations for why democracy can't take hold in certain places. So for a while, the Asians were all to Confucian and they had these values. But of course now, there's South Korea and there's Taiwan and there's Japan. Okay, so then the Latin Americans, well, they just like caudillos. Men on horseback. So when I first taught civil-military relations at Stanford, which Mike reminded me was a long, long time ago in the early 80s when Stanford hired me at the age of 11, I used to teach civil-military relations, and I always had at least one military coup to talk about in Latin America. Now it's Chile and Colombia and Brazil, et cetera. We had the Africans are too tribal. Right? But now you look at even unfinished democracies like a Ghana or or a Botswana or even a South Africa, which struggles but is democratic. And it reminds me, oh, by the way, the Germans were too martial, right? They just obeyed orders,
right.
Which I used to remind them when they used to say how the Iraqis didn't have culture for this, because I can't stand that explanation from the Europeans. Well, those people aren't ready. And I would say, well, thank God nobody gave up on you in 1943. Right? So it's a kind of, because it's patronizing. There are these people in the world who just can't get it right like we did. And so finally I would say to people, and oh, by the way, in America, blacks were once too childlike, slaves, Negroes, coloreds were too childlike to care about vote. So when are we going to stop this stuff about there are just some people who can't get it right and recognize that it's a complex story of what they've been through, what their hopes and aspirations, the various kinds of challenges they face, and what kinds of institutions can mitigate these, quote, cultural issues within any given place.
Frank, last word.
Well,
last question.
I just feel if I don't ask this question, somebody in the audience is going to. So you've been working on this book for quite a number of years, and we had a rather large political earthquake in 2016. We have a president that has picked fights with Australia, Canada, Germany, South Korea, and has seemed to have nothing but praise for Duterte in the Philippines, the most recent one, Sisi in Egypt, of course, Vladimir Putin, Erdogan, an increasingly long list. So I want to know, why are you not in a blind panic about the state of American foreign policy as I am, or I suspect Larry is?
Well, first of all, because I've seen movies before about about American foreign policy and how we should all be panicked. Let me say, I did add a little section at the end called 2016, and it was less about specifically our circumstances than the kind of populist challenge, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Populism, isolationism, nativism, protectionism, which didn't work out so well the last time around, and so there is a little section. Look, I think that the story of where this administration will end up is still unfolding. I will say it's a really good foreign policy team. I think they are strong. I think that in the early days of any administration, the White House is kind of first on, and you get kind of very great chaotic policies, and then the agencies come in, and I do hope they get staffed up, and they get staffed up, and they're different. The president comes to this job having never served in government, having never sniffed government before. And I think that you're seeing somebody who sort of says perhaps what's on top of mind, and sometimes says it in a way that we find jarring. So yes, I found jarring the comment about Duterte, because after all, you know, he said nothing good about the United States. He's trying to expropriate. I suspect that when you talk about meeting him or so forth, you're trying to say, look, I can talk with and negotiate with anybody. One of the things I think you eventually learn as president is that one thing that's different than being on the outside is interests are not, sometimes you can't cut a deal around interests. Sometimes you just have conflicting interests. And I think this will emerge, and he will see that. I never thought the Putin thing was going to last. Because my view was, you know, once it was clear there was only one alpha male in international politics, that bromance wasn't going to go very far. And I think that Putin is who he is, and it's coming clear in the way that he's behaving. But, you know, let's give it a chance. You know where I stand. I believe strongly in an active America in the international system, because this is a system that after World War II, we and our allies built on the proposition that free markets, free economies, free peoples, free politics, and American military power to protect it all would not just protect them and their interest, it would protect us and our interest. And I fundamentally believe that. I don't believe that you can do that long run if you don't also represent the values of this country. Because I'll say one other thing about democracies. We all understand, or people understand, the moral case. When you see somebody willing to be jailed or persecuted or even killed, and we've seen them throughout history, you can't help but be moved by the fact that people who just want to have the basic rights that you have need to be supported. That's the moral case. But there's also a very practical case about democracy. We know that consolidated democracies don't fight one another. Democratic peace. And in fact, the Allies, the Americans and the Allies, took a big gamble after World War II on the democratic peace, that if Germany would be democratic under Konrad Adenauer and his successors, and Japan would be democratic, constitutional democracy, but democratic, they wouldn't threaten the neighborhood again. Not only do they not threaten the neighborhood, they are two of the rocks of the international system. And democracies don't send child soldiers into battle. And democracies don't, as a matter of state policy, traffic in human beings. And democracies don't, as a matter of state policy, support state-sponsor terrorists. And so we have both a moral and a practical case for wanting to see both our values and our interests represented in the international system. And I would argue that in the long run, a balance of power that favors freedom is actually in America's interest.
Great. So we have some time for questions from the audience. My only request is that once you get the microphone, if you could introduce yourself and then ask a question. Right here, Anya.
Hello, my name is Anya Shkurko, and thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts recently China has become a great superpower, and what they do, they just go into different countries, like developing countries in Africa, Eastern Europe, pour huge amounts of money, bring their workers, bring their system, their values, and I wouldn't say promoting democracy Chinese way, but promoting Chinese culture through the investments. How would you compare this to American way, and what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, thank you. I think that first of all, China is a great power, and it's a rising power, and it's going to be influential in the international system, full stop. And one of the challenges is to figure how to channel Chinese influence in ways that are actually not disruptive to the international system. We've got something going for us in that China is about as integrated into the international economy as you can be. Nobody can imagine Chinese economic growth without international economic growth and vice versa. So we've got something going for us that, by the way, we don't have going for us with Russia, which is not as integrated into the international economy. China, I would have said 5, 7, 10 years ago, was essentially engaged in a mercantilist foreign policy. So what was good for the Chinese economy was good for Chinese foreign policy. And it showed up in, for instance, the desire for commodities. And so you go to where there are commodities producers and you develop relationships there and you get trade relationships and trade benefits. You do things like, since Africa has a lot of commodities, you build the African Union building in Addis because that impresses us. But it was all somehow tied to the Chinese economy. I think we're seeing an evolution. The immediate place that we are is, I think it actually looks more like China is trying to reconstitute what it lost out of colonialism. So it's all about the region. It's about the South China Sea. It's about Taiwan and the Straits. It's about Hong Kong, which has been brought back. I don't mean to make an exact parallel, but it's interesting. When people say the United States was so isolationist in the 19th century, I say, if the United States was isolationist, how did it get to be so big? No, the United States was actually consolidating the continent in the 19th century, both east and west and north and south, and fought some wars to be able to do that. I think what you're seeing is China's attempt to consolidate its neighborhood, but it's bumping up against us, as it well should, because sometimes the consolidation of your neighborhood means running over the interests and territories of other people. Now, will that eventually become a China that looks more like a great power with a view of how human history ought to unfold? The United States after World War II had a view of how human history ought to unfold. Free markets, free peoples. It was not always perfectly executed. We made some exceptions like the Middle East, but that was basically the view. The Soviet Union had a view of how the international system ought to unfold. And the way that you know that countries, that great powers have a view, is they try to replicate themselves in the international system. I don't yet see China as having a view. They have a model that some are attracted to, but good luck if you are Orban trying to do what China has done with 1 billion people and the resources that they have and the ability to organize that they have. So I'm not sure it's a model that translates very easily. I think Putin is much more trying to be that model for the authoritarian strongman. So I think the Chinese are not quite yet there, where they have a Chinese way. What they have is a way to serve Chinese interests. It could evolve in that way, but I don't see it yet.
I saw Neil next, right over here.
Neil Ferguson, Hoover Institution, Secretary Rice. It's a terrific and really important book. I read it at a very early stage. And I actually want to talk about something that hasn't been mentioned in the discussion that seemed a really important theme in that early draft, and that's the notion of a global thermidor, a global shift away from democracy. One problem about writing books is that they go to press and then months pass. And I want you to talk about things that have happened since you went to press and how far events in the recent past bear out that thesis that democracy is in some kind of global crisis. Are there really strong men to the left of us, strong men to the right of us? Is this a crisis of democracy, or is it a crisis of liberal democracy? In other words, are we going to carry on seeing elections, but will these elections be phony elections that simply legitimize the rule of strong men? So talk a bit about these recent trends.
By the way, before
Yeah.
you do, why
Yeah.
in the 21st century is there such a lag time between when you finish a book when it's printed?
Well, it was
You'd
a
think
lot
we would-
shorter in this case.
Yeah, it was
than
pretty
most
short.
of
It was
them.
actually pretty short.
All right.
First of all, thank you, Neil, because you did read it in early manuscript. And as by the way, I just have to thank a bunch of my colleagues in this room who either read parts or gave me ideas or whatever. It's one of the great things about colleagueship in a place like this. Look, I actually think, and Larry and I have had this conversation. Larry has written that democracy is in recession, and I wrote an essay for a volume that Larry did on this. I think we may be reacting to the fact that we're not getting what we had all hoped, which was the sprint toward more and more democracies, but rather we're getting some that seem to be just kind of crawling along. We're getting some that might even be reverting a bit, like the Hungaries or the Turkeys of the world, maybe the Poland, which we worry about. But I think if you still look at where we are today versus where we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if you don't look through the rose-colored glasses of where we might have been in 20 years, democracy is doing okay. Now, that doesn't mean, and by democracy, I don't mean just elections. I mean people that actually are improving rule of law, people who are actually working so that institutions like independent judiciaries actually work, people like the Colombians who are taking back territory, people like the Argentines who are reinvigorating their democracy after a period of kind of quasi-authoritarianism under the Kirchners. I think it's a mixed picture, but I would say that if you do the puts and takes, it's still a little bit ahead. It's just not as far ahead as we once thought. Now, what are the two challenges, or as we had hoped it would be? Now, what are the two big challenges to that? Three big challenges. One is the Middle East, where the kind of institutional infrastructure is still not very strong for the emergence of democracies. And if you are a democracy, Israel, Tunisia, maybe an emerging Iraq, the neighborhood's not great from this point of view. So that's a challenge. A second challenge, I think, is that even mature democracies are having trouble with governance. They're having trouble getting things done. But if you look at the American system, federalism is helping us a lot because while Washington remains in deadlock, the states are doing all kinds of things. So one question is, what can you do to devolve power in places where you're getting granted? The other big challenge is the one I addressed in 2016. Illiberal democracy, or I don't actually even like associating with word democracy. What you have is illiberal institutions or illiberal constituencies that are keeping in power strong men, because they no longer have to take tanks into the streets. So Putin doesn't have to take tanks in the streets. He's got a constituency out there in the countryside and pensioners and the like. Erdogan doesn't have to, he did at one point, but he doesn't have to take tanks in the streets because he's got pious people that were left out of the period under Kemalism, and they support him. So it's not as if they don't have some basis of support, they do. That's a threat. I'm even more concerned, though, about, as I called it, populism, nativism, isolationism, protectionism, the four horses of the apocalypse. Because democracy won't progress if people who are working for it are isolated from a global order that believes in them. And that, I think, has taken a little bit of a turn for the worse since I put the last period on this book, and that's why I wrote the little 2016. It's taken a little bit of a turn for the worse because terrorism is an easy way to, the response to terrorism, you can take the easy way out, which is to say it's the fault of those people and we're going to close ourselves off. Or you can do the hard work of fighting it, but that's a lot less satisfying. And so you're seeing people in all kinds of democracies now who don't believe that their governments represent their fears or their aspirations. And I don't know quite how that turns out for even mature democracies.
President Ilves, I saw next. And I saw you actually before President Ilves. So can we get the microphone there and then up to Tom?
Yeah. No. You're up, Tom. Thomas, you're up.
Two things. One brief thing, just foreign policy is not just an academic activity, and I wanted to say that 10 years ago and 1 week ago, my country was under threat. And a lot of people didn't, they were saying, okay, so let's see what happens. But Conde, you called me up right when it was really bad. So thank you. Now more academically, I mean, again, as this kind of patronizing Orientalism that many of Eastern, not only sort of Africans have had and Confucianists, but also East Europeans, is something I agree. You have to get rid of it. On the other hand, there is, if you look at Robert Putnam's stuff on sort of where democracy flourished in Italy, there is a long historical development. So that, if 700 years ago, it was one of the most depressing things to read. But if 700 years ago you had a civil society in Florence, then it's not bad in northern Italy. Whereas if you have a feudal society up until recent times and maybe even continuing in southern Italy, then it's really bad. And you could say that in many ways where Russia differs from most of Eastern Europe, at least the sort of northern half of it, is that there was in the 19th century already a civil society, even under sort of monarchical imperial rule, but there was that already there. How much do you see civil society as a key factor? And if it is there, then maybe we should sort of expand our time frame for the sort of we shouldn't wait for democracy to happen overnight unless the seeds have been there for a while.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, look, civil society is absolutely key, and absolutely, if you have a vibrant civil society, you've got a head start. I write about the Kenyan case because I was involved trying to help Kofi Annan bring about a unity government after the election of 2007 ended so violently. Probably the greatest asset there was civil society, was actually stronger in Kenya than you might have imagined. So there are places that dot the globe that have strong civil societies for whatever reason, and they are a real asset when you're trying to build democracy. I will say that, with all due respect to my colleague Bob Putnam, who wrote a great book on this, things have sped up a bit since 700 years ago. And one of the goals of foreign policy has to be not to speed up our clock about when democracy is going to take hold, because that we can't control, but to speed up the process of creating that infrastructure like civil society. So something you would remember well, Thomas, the much at the time maligned CSCE, Council on Cooperation and Security in Europe. The CSCE actually was a place that human rights groups throughout Eastern Europe and even in the Soviet Union, because of the so-called human rights basket, which the Soviets signed on to because they really wanted the economic and political basket, and they believed it was going to legitimize their rule in Europe. What it did was give voice and protection to those civil society groups which emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you can get about the business of helping these civil societies build, and it's absolutely critical. Every year we bring the Draper Fellows here, and they are the most amazing young activists from around the world who are trying to do even the smallest work, women's empowerment work, or election monitoring, or trying to build a little business, and support those people. One of them might actually turn out to be Lech Walesa. One of them might actually turn out to be Nelson Mandela. And so that's another piece.
3 of them are serving in the Ukrainian parliament now.
Exactly. So this is an important one. I'll make the final point. We forget how fast sometimes things do happen. So in I remember speaking, or it was either, I think it was a hearing, but it might have been a briefing before Senate Foreign Relations, and we had just helped the Afghans finish their constitution. And the Afghan constitution starts out with a preamble that says, we will abide by Sharia law and individual rights. And the senator said, what a terrible compromise. What a horrible compromise. How could you have signed under that? He said, well, it's not half as bad as the compromise that made my ancestors 3/5 of a man in the first American Constitution, right? And by the way, that same Constitution had to finally actually make 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments matter with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. I was a child, so not that long ago. Well, maybe a long time ago, not that long ago. And oh, by the way, that same Constitution is the one that I took an oath of office to as Secretary of State in 2005. So things can change. And my only challenge to those who would say it, and I've said it, it takes a long time, is don't make that an excuse for not getting started.
Great. Here in the back, yeah.
I'm wondering, it's possible you just answered this, but I'm wondering in unconsolidated African democracies, so places like Liberia and Nigeria, what you see to be the most effective tools that the U.S. has to support democratic institutions?
I would give a different answer to the two cases, and one of the things that I try to say in this book is, no one size fits all. So if you're Secretary of State, you can't have a kind of cookie cutter approach to all of them. I look at Nigeria and I see some positive signs. So for instance, sometimes it's small things. So Goodluck Jonathan actually calls his successor, the person who's defeated him, and says, "You're now the president, I concede, good luck."
First time in Nigerian
First
history.
time in Nigerian history. We just sort of pass that off as, oh, well, of course. Well, you couldn't take that for granted since Nigerian independence. So I see things beginning to happen. I think Larry, who really knows Nigeria way better than I, would tell you that some things are starting to happen on the corruption front. You're starting to get some people coming back from having worked in places like the World Bank. And by the way, one thing that we sometimes undervalue is how people in developing countries go and work in institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or even the UN, and they go back and they are able to carry those processes and those values to their countries. If you look at Liberia, I actually think you've just got a really good government to work with there that's trying to do the right things. It's extremely hard, 25 years of civil war. They finally sort of make the transition, and then Ebola happens. But they are a Millennium Challenge country, and one of the things that the Millennium Challenge tries to do is to say, let's not talk about how you're going to arrange your parliament or how often you're going to have presidential elections, speaking to the point about just not elections. But what's your biggest kind of political economic problem? And some of these places it'll be the power grid is unreliable. Or you don't have land titling, so you can't combine all these inefficient subsistence farms, so you can't deliver food to the population. Now, the most remarkable thing, though, then is you get to do two things with those countries. One is something that the Jordanians told me when they were an MCC country. For the first time, they had to call together all the stakeholders and have a conversation about what they were actually going to apply for in their compact with the United States. So it's a kind of democratic process that takes place. And you don't get to the government doesn't say, here's what the farmers need. The farmers actually get asked. In Lesotho, it was an effort to do some business, to allow some business support capital. But Lesotho had on the books that women couldn't own property in their own name. Well, what happened to that? The United States said, not going to happen. They changed the law. So I wouldn't underestimate, we tend to talk, because we're political scientists, we tend to talk about the big political changes. You have to write a constitution, you have to guarantee these kinds of rights, you have to deal with ethnic issues, you have to protect ethnic minorities. That's all very important. But I was struck, and I titled the chapter this, I'm struck how the America's founding document actually says the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness, really? Well, the pursuit of fulfillment is perhaps a better phrase. And sometimes governments have to create the conditions where people can pursue fulfillment, or they don't last very long. We have a conceit that democracies are bad at this and authoritarians are good at it. The Chinese have been pretty good at it. Give them credit, what they've achieved. Singapore was pretty good at it. Give Lee Kuan Yew credit for what he achieved. But now your examples are one of the smallest countries in the world that happen to get a really wise man, and one of the biggest countries in the world that has going for it a population where prosperity is actually providing legitimacy. There are plenty of bad authoritarian rulers. Just talk to the people in Caracas today. So we should not buy into that. Yeah, democracies are slower, they're less efficient, you've got all these veto groups. But you know something about democracies? You might not get things done very fast. You're less likely to make a really big mistake, like the one-child policy in China. Because one thing authoritarians can do is they can make it happen. And that's good, but if you're going to be omnipotent, you better be omniscient too. So I think we don't speak enough for democracies and trying to help them to deliver the pursuit of happiness.
Tom, and then you over here.
Condi, I want to get you to reflect a little bit on Afghanistan in the context of what we've been talking about today, and get you to reflect a little bit as to where we might have done things differently. I mean, it was very clear that we went into Afghanistan to take out the launching pad from the attacks, from which the 9/11 attack was perpetrated. But as we've gone on, we're now almost 15, 16 years into trying to fix Afghanistan. Cynics or critics would say there's been incredible mission creep. But I really like, whether it's women's rights, whether it's wiping out the drugs, whether it's dealing with the corruption, whether it's dealing with the absence of infrastructure within the company, never mind the complications of the politics. But what are the lessons learned, or what, on reflection, what would you do differently today when we went in there, and maybe what should we be doing today?
Well, look, Afghanistan is very hard. Tom, I don't have to tell you, you've seen it. It was always going to be hard, okay, because it was at the time of 9/11, it was the fifth poorest country in the world. It had experienced 25 years of civil war. It was basically still in civil war with the Northern Alliance with maybe 10% of the territory in the north and the Taliban holding the other 90%, but just a very difficult place. And I remember flying into Afghanistan the first time, flying over the high mountains and thinking, these people were bequeathed high mountains and dirt. It's really very tough. So, what's the good news? The good news is that the Taliban no longer executes people in a soccer stadium that was given to them by the UN. The good news is that girls go to school. I think something like 40% of the women, 40% of the students in university are women. The good news is that in a very patriarchal, and this is a point to Thomas's point, this is a very patriarchal society, but even in that very patriarchal society, you are seeing women challenge clerics that abuse them and sexually assault them and do it in court, and in some cases they're winning. So some things are progressing. On the other hand, the security situation remains very, very tough. And I've always thought that my marker was, could you prevent the Taliban from being an existential threat to Kabul? And you get some cases where you wonder if they're getting closer to Kabul, not further from Kabul. And so I'm worried about it. But I will say that starting with President Obama, and now I think continuing with President Trump, you're seeing a pretty active American effort to try and beat back any advances that the Taliban might make. The Afghan forces are, by most accounts, getting better, although we've been saying that for a long time. And the big issue that Afghanistan also has is it sits on the border with Pakistan. And with that big northwest frontier, people coming in and out, back and forth, it's really hard to do something about the security situation, particularly in the south, given the Pakistan. So the formula is not unlike it was by about 2003. You've got to do something about Pakistan, and it's still uncertainty about how it feels about a stable Afghanistan. I've read reports that the Russians are now sending some armament to the Taliban. That ought to be a conversation with Mr. Putin about, you really want back into Afghanistan? Really? After what you experienced there? Really? And maybe that ought to be published in the Russian papers, where there's still too many mothers of dead Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers, who might just remember that. And then you've got to do something, to continue to try to improve governance. But it's a very hard place. I think we're finally going to eventually have to get to a question of what is, at least for the time being, good enough in Afghanistan. And I don't mean on the governance side. I really mean in terms of the war itself. I'm not inside the information to know what we now think about the possibility of hiving off some of the Taliban for something that looks like a peace agreement, while making sure that those who still engage in terrorist activities are. I don't know whether a Northern Ireland agreement is possible in Afghanistan, but if I were in the administration, I'd be asking the question.
So we're running out of time. You have a here, and George, did you want to get on this? No. Then this will be the last question. I apologize.
I'm honored. My name is Ieva Ilves. I'm a partner of President Ilves, but I also have been many years all my life working for government of Latvia, and including doing some sort of democracy projects, if one can call them, like Belarus, Georgia, Azerbaijan. And I'm really honored for this discussion. It was very close to my heart. But I want to ask a question about the future. And you referred a lot about keeping to project democracies, promote them, and keep doing this work and help supporting even a few individuals. But I want to raise a question back to US in the given current situation. How do you see it? And I'm here a little bit concerned because as I worked as a European Union diplomat, for example, in Azerbaijan already a few years ago, I got this question throwing back saying, look at Italy, look at Berlusconi, look at others, how you are doing yourself. And I quite well imagine currently this situation that the questions will be thrown back, how the things happened in US, how the US leadership and the country is run, where are the line between your business, your corruption, where is the state, where is your private, how the media is treated. I mean, all these questions, they come immediately on surface and are noticed. And no doubt that the US leadership is extremely important to keep promote democracy. So I wonder what's your take on that? And given that US is in such a state, and then we look at Europe, who is very much busy with its own problems, or London being busy with Brexit and others. So I am a little bit concerned where we are moving with democracy promotions. I might agree that we are not that bad right now with democracies. Maybe we are doing okay, as you mentioned. But I am concerned with the current leadership in democratic countries, where we'll be heading to, because that's extremely important point of reference for those, especially for those countries who are kind of neither very democratic or not totalitarian, but still need the support.
We're still searching, yes.
Okay,
No, it's a really good question. There's a moment in the book where I quoted a judge from the time in the South when South Carolina had a case on voting rights that turned out, from his point of view, the wrong way. And he said that he worried about how what happens in America affects our ability to speak in the world. And so, yes, I think this is true. But I would say to people the following. First of all right, so we've had a little bit of an unusual election in the United States. We've elected a president who'd never had any experience, first time in our history. But people actually who were dissatisfied and believed they had been left out, my friends call it the "do you hear me now" people, found themselves a candidate, went to the polls and elected him. Right? And
like
so
democracy.
I think that's democracy. And for those who might have wished a different outcome, well, that's the way democracy works. So that would be the first thing I would say. Secondly, I would say we shouldn't yet have we don't yet know where I think the administration's ultimately going to come down on the question of the role of American values in our foreign policy. You see hints of it when you see the president so moved by a Syrian child choking on the chemical weapons. There's something about being the president of the United States and not being able to look the other way when bad things happen in the world. And so I hope that the president will get a chance when he travels abroad to meet with democracy advocates, to meet with people who are refusing to take no for an answer on should they have the same rights that we have. As I said, people who are risking jail and religious objectors, and they are inspiring people. One of the most inspiring people I met actually was a Russian woman who had created a civil society group in Russia about the rights of the disabled. Now, those of us who are Russianists know that the Soviet Union and Russia before it, because the Soviet man and even the Russian man was supposed to be perfect, they literally would sweep disabled people off the streets. And she had limited sight. She said, that can't happen anymore. Right? So these are inspiring people, and I hope the president, gets to meet some of these inspiring people. I would say to the rest of the world, though, America's a North Star. It's not because we're perfect. It's because we're really imperfect. It's because we started out with this birth defect called slavery. And even today, it affects the way that we look at each other and what we sometimes see and how we behave. And yet, we keep stumbling ahead and getting a little bit better, and we the people becomes an ever broader definition in the United States. And I stand to be sworn in under a portrait of Benjamin Franklin by a Jewish woman Supreme Court Justice, and I think to myself, what would he have thought, right? He wouldn't have seen it coming. So it's not perfection. Madison said, I never expected the American Constitution to be the perfect work by perfect men. Democracy is actually the best system because it moderates and mitigates against imperfections. Authoritarianism, because all power resides in one or a few, is likely to exacerbate human imperfections. And so I would say to them, whatever you think about how we're stumbling and how it's hard and how we're cacophonous and how we yell at each other and all those things, we're just getting up every day and we're trying to put another brick in the edifice of American democracy. And wherever you are and whoever you are, you need to do the same.
Wow. So I don't want to ruin that ending, but I actually have to. First, I want to thank Frank and Larry for their great comments and questions. Second, the most important thing I want to do is I want to tell you, you now have to go buy the book, okay? You got a little appetizer. You need to go buy the main course now. You need to advertise it, especially these young people, on Facebook and Twitter and VKontakte. Get this book around, because I think what you just heard, I don't think you timed it this way, but what better anecdote to some of the anxieties around the world in our own country than this brand new book of which you just heard about. So the last thing I just want to say again is congratulations, Condi.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. That was really fantastic.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.